Good evening, and welcome to Strategic Layer. Tonight, we examine a development that has fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the Black Sea region. What we're discussing is not a single battle or temporary setback, but a deep structural shift in maritime power that carries profound implications for European security, global trade, and NATO's strategic posture. This is an analysis that requires careful examination of military logic, historical context, and geopolitical reality. Let's begin. For nearly 2 years, Western strategic planning operated on a core assumption about the Black Sea theater. The prevailing narrative suggested that this maritime front had stabilized, that the situation was balanced, and that time itself was working in favor of Western objectives. Military analysts, political leaders, and defense planners operated under the belief that the Black Sea had become what some called a frozen theater, unlikely to produce sudden or dramatic changes. That assumption has now collapsed, not through a spectacular military engagement or shocking headline, but through a methodical process that occurred while international attention focused elsewhere. What has emerged is the opening of what is now referred to as the Odessa corridor, a development that represents a fundamental shift in the regional balance of power. This is not hyperbole or dramatic interpretation. This represents a factual change in the strategic environment, one with direct consequences for Ukrainian sovereignty, NATO credibility, and the broader European security architecture. Understanding what occurred, why it occurred, and what it means for the future requires examining multiple dimensions: historical context, military operations, economic implications, and alliance strategy. To comprehend the significance of current developments, we must understand that Odessa's strategic importance is not a recent phenomenon. This city holds a place in Russian strategic thinking that extends back centuries, rooted in imperial history and fundamental geographical realities. From Moscow's perspective, Odessa has always represented far more than simply another Ukrainian city. It is the country's only truly viable deep-water port capable of handling large-scale commercial shipping. Before this conflict began, Odessa and its nearby port facilities handled the majority of Ukraine's exports, particularly grain and steel. These are not symbolic commodities. Ukrainian grain feeds significant portions of the global south, while Ukrainian steel supports industrial supply chains extending far beyond Eastern Europe. The historical context matters enormously. In the late 18th century, following a series of decisive military victories over the Ottoman Empire, Russia began systematic southward expansion under Catherine the Great. This expansion was formalized through what became known as the Novorossiya project, a concrete geopolitical design aimed at resolving one of Russia's most persistent strategic vulnerabilities: the lack of reliable access to warm water ports. In 1794, Odessa was deliberately founded as the southern gateway of the Russian Empire. For centuries, geography had constrained Russian economic and naval power. Northern ports froze for extended periods, limiting trade, naval projection, and international influence. Odessa was created specifically to break that structural limitation. From its earliest days, the city was designed to serve imperial interests. It rapidly developed into one of the most important commercial centers in the Russian world, eventually becoming the empire's fourth largest city. Odessa was never simply a commercial port. It was a naval anchor at the heart of Russian power in the Black Sea. This historical continuity exposes a fundamental Western misunderstanding of the current conflict. Russian leadership did not suddenly decide in 2022 that Odessa mattered. The objective was articulated openly from the earliest stages of the war. Senior Russian military figures spoke clearly about securing southern Ukraine and establishing a continuous land and maritime corridor. As the conflict progressed, Western focus narrowed in ways that proved deeply consequential. Political, media, and military attention concentrated almost entirely on the Eastern Front. This narrowing of analysis shaped later phases of the conflict in significant ways. While international attention remained fixed on the Donbas region, absorbing resources, political capital, and strategic messaging, the southern coastal theater evolved with far less scrutiny. This imbalance mattered enormously. When Kherson fell, Odessa became Ukraine's primary economic lifeline. Yet NATO capitals continued to interpret the war largely as a land conflict centered in the east. Ukraine committed many of its most experienced military units to prolonged attritional battles aimed at slowing Russian advances in the Donbass. That effort carried a hidden strategic cost. It gave Moscow the time and operational freedom needed to shape the southern coastal theater according to Russian strategic objectives. The true center of gravity was never purely territorial. It was, and remains, geoeconomic control of the Black Sea. This fundamental misunderstanding allowed Russia to methodically prepare the conditions necessary to open the Odessa corridor. The question of how this corridor was actually established challenges many assumptions that dominated Western analysis from the start. There was no dramatic amphibious landing, no single decisive naval battle, and no sudden collapse of Ukrainian defenses. Despite years of predictions focused on a spectacular assault on Odessa, what unfolded was far more methodical. Russia executed a calculated strategy designed to collapse the region's ability to function militarily and economically without ever needing to capture the city itself. This approach exposed structural weaknesses not only in Ukraine's defensive posture, but also in how NATO chose to provide support. The first and most decisive phase of this operation focused on logistics rather than territory. Moscow's objective was isolation, not occupation. The aim was to sever the arteries sustaining Odessa and what remained of Ukraine's naval presence in the Black Sea. To achieve this, Russia relied on persistent long-range strikes using precision weapons, including cruise missiles, glide bombs, and high-explosive munitions. These attacks were not symbolic gestures or sporadic acts of pressure. They were systematic and sustained. Critical infrastructure became the primary target set. Rail hubs, fuel depots, ammunition storage sites, and port logistics facilities were struck repeatedly with clear intent. Bridges and rail links connecting Odessa to the rest of Ukraine and to NATO's primary supply corridor through Romania were steadily degraded. The repeated strikes on the Zatoka Bridge were particularly significant. That bridge carries the coastal rail line linking Odessa to the Romanian border. Its neutralization sent a clear strategic message: isolate the region and make large-scale military resupply impractical. As these strikes accumulated over time, the resilience of Ukraine's coastal logistics network eroded. What had once functioned as a defensive zone gradually became a logistical burden. The ports of Odessa, while largely intact in physical terms, were rendered functionally ineffective for high-volume military operations. At sea, the balance shifted just as decisively. In the early stages of the war, Ukrainian naval drones achieved notable tactical successes against Russian Black Sea Fleet assets. These operations demonstrated creativity and adaptability and forced Moscow to adjust its posture. However, they failed to dismantle the core of Russia's maritime strategy, which was area denial. The Black Sea Fleet adapted by operating from protected anchorages and reinforcing layered air defenses. More importantly, Russia expanded its long-range anti-ship and land attack missile envelope, increasing both reach and density. Over time, Moscow pushed Ukraine's controllable maritime space closer and closer to the coastline. This did not result in a visible blockade enforced by surface ships. Instead, it produced something more effective: a risk-based blockade. Commercial shipping became economically unviable. Insurance premiums surged. Routes were abandoned. Trade slowed and then halted. In practical terms, the Black Sea became a controlled zone under Russian dominance. The final layer of pressure came from land operations that completed the encirclement. Sustained Russian advances in the Eastern Theater, particularly around key logistical corridors, forced Kiev to commit its most capable formations to the Donbass. These experienced units became locked into attritional battles that required constant reinforcement. This created a strategic trap. By fixing Ukrainian attention, manpower, and resources in the east, Russia stripped the southern coastal sector of defensive depth. The Odessa-Mykolaiv axis was left under-resourced and unable to absorb sustained pressure. Any attempt to reinforce it risked collapse elsewhere on the front. This was not the result of negligence or incompetence. It was the consequence of force prioritization under extreme pressure. Moscow exploited this reality with precision. The corridor did not need to be physically seized through ground assault. It only needed to be controlled through a combination of maritime dominance and logistical strangulation. The strategic impact of this development was immediate and far-reaching. Russia established local dominance in the northwestern Black Sea and with it, effective control over Ukraine's maritime access points. The corridor reshaped not only the military balance but also the economic equation of the entire conflict. Moscow gained the ability to dictate commercial terms unilaterally, depriving Ukraine of a significant share of its export revenue. Odessa shifted from being an economic lifeline to a strategic liability. This moment marked a clear inflection point in the conflict. From this point forward, analysis cannot remain confined to battlefield mechanics alone. The opening of the Odessa corridor is not merely a setback for Ukraine. It represents a direct challenge to NATO's credibility, strategy, and deterrence model. At the center of this development lies a flawed assumption that shaped alliance policy from the outset. From the beginning, NATO leaders spoke confidently about eventual victory while in practice implementing a carefully managed containment strategy. The goal was to support Ukraine without provoking wider confrontation. But this balancing act came at a cost. Weapons deliveries were gradual, limited in scale, and often arrived too late to shape strategic outcomes. What emerged was a prolonged war of attrition, and wars of attrition favor the side with greater industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and logistical endurance. In this case, that side was Russia. While Moscow reorganized its economy to sustain military production, increasing output of artillery, drones, glide bombs, and missiles, NATO's industrial base remained largely configured for peacetime conditions. Western support relied heavily on sophisticated and expensive systems delivered in relatively small numbers. These systems were impressive technologically, but they lacked the volume and persistence needed to counter sustained pressure. Bureaucratic delays, political hesitation, and high costs constrained the pace and scale of assistance. Russia pursued the opposite approach. It prioritized mass, endurance, and cost efficiency. In the coastal campaign, that imbalance proved decisive. Moscow's sustained pressure created slow but relentless logistical paralysis. Ukraine could not repair infrastructure as fast as it was destroyed, and NATO could not replenish defensive systems quickly enough to reverse the trend. This development has reshaped the threat environment facing the alliance. What had been presented as a regional conflict confined to Ukraine has evolved into a direct strategic challenge to NATO's southeastern flank. Romania and Bulgaria, both alliance members, now face a maritime boundary dominated by Russia. The Black Sea has ceased to function as a buffer zone. It has become an area of strategic competition in which Moscow holds a clear positional advantage. The implications for deterrence are serious. Deterrence does not rest on statements or symbolic declarations. It depends on demonstrated capability and willingness to enforce commitments. When boundaries shift repeatedly without decisive response, credibility erodes. Moscow has observed this pattern throughout the war and acted accordingly. The opening of the Odessa corridor confirms that the West was either unwilling or unable to commit the resources necessary to block a critical strategic objective for the Kremlin. The second level of failure was industrial. Modern war at this scale is decided as much in factories and supply chains as on the battlefield. Russia adapted its economy to sustain military output, while Western industry remained constrained by cost structures, regulatory hurdles, and political caution. Continuous Russian pressure produced a cumulative effect. Infrastructure degradation outpaced repair, and defensive capabilities eroded faster than they could be replaced. This slow imbalance reshaped the strategic reality in the Black Sea. Long-range strikes that destroyed rail connections, bridges, and port logistics nodes continued because the defensive systems capable of stopping them were never deployed in sufficient numbers or in the right locations. Advanced air defense systems were announced repeatedly, but deliveries were slow, fragmented, and often disconnected from operational needs. In many cases, they were assigned to protect specific cities rather than entire operational theaters. The southern coastline remained exposed, not because of a single tactical error, but because of deliberate strategic prioritization that focused resources elsewhere. With this shift comes a set of scenarios that are no longer theoretical, but increasingly plausible. The central question is no longer whether the situation in the Black Sea is contained, but how far Moscow is prepared to press its advantage and how the West will respond. The most likely scenario is also the least dramatic on the surface. Russia consolidates control over the corridor without launching a costly urban assault on Odessa itself. By maintaining maritime dominance and sustained air superiority over surrounding ports, Moscow can achieve most of its objectives without engaging in prolonged street fighting. In this scenario, Odessa may remain formally under Ukrainian control, but its economic function would be effectively neutralized. Commercial activity becomes impossible without Russian consent. The flow of grain, steel, and shipping becomes subject to regulation, delay, or outright denial. What emerges is a frozen phase of the conflict, not defined by ceasefire lines on land, but by control of access to the sea. Ukraine may retain territory, but it loses economic autonomy and strategic flexibility. With coastal flanks secured, Russian focus could then shift westward. The long-discussed objective of establishing a connection to Transnistria, the pro-Russian region of Moldova, becomes operationally feasible from a stabilized southern perimeter. Creating a land link to this enclave would carry relatively limited military risk under these conditions. The implications would be severe. Moldova's sovereignty would be directly challenged, and the conflict would move dangerously close to NATO's borders. Romania, a member of the alliance, would suddenly face a Russian-controlled corridor along its frontier. The most dangerous scenario lies in a rushed attempt to reverse the corridor by force. Under growing domestic political pressure, NATO could be tempted to deploy naval assets or advanced air defense systems directly into the Odessa region. The stated aim would be to secure commercial shipping and restore maritime access. In practice, such a move would carry high risk of direct confrontation. The Black Sea would become an active friction zone. Russian long-range missile systems would target Western deployments, while NATO air defenses would be forced into active combat roles. The risk of miscalculation would be extreme. Even a limited exchange could escalate rapidly and unpredictably. The opening of the Odessa corridor represents the most significant strategic defeat the West has suffered in this conflict so far. It was not the result of a single tactical failure, but the culmination of sustained strategic miscalculation over nearly 2 years. NATO underestimated the importance of the Black Sea maritime dimension while focusing almost exclusively on the land war in eastern Ukraine. The alliance failed to match Russia's industrial mobilization and sustained pressure with adequate defensive support. The result is a fundamental shift in the regional balance of power with consequences extending far beyond Ukraine. Understanding this development is essential for anyone analyzing this conflict or considering its implications for European security. The assumptions that guided Western strategy for 2 years have proven false. What comes next will depend on whether the alliance can adapt to this new reality or whether further strategic ground will be conceded. Thank you for watching Strategic Layer. We'll continue monitoring these developments and providing in-depth analysis. Please subscribe for continued coverage of this critical situation.